Hello dear students, welcome back to Bosco Conversation, YouTube channel of Kottayam Don Bosco College. I am Raniar, faculty member of PG Department of English. This is the second lecture of the series European Literature. In the last class, we had covered first two periods in the history of literary Europe. The first one was Dark Age and the second one was the Ancient Classical period. In this class, we are going to discuss more about the Middle Ages and the Renaissance period. Okay, so let's begin with the Middle Ages. So the Middle Age in the history of Europe had covered almost 1000 years, right from 500 AD to 1500 AD. And the initial years of this Middle Ages was also known as Dark Age because of the scarcity of literary output as well as cultural output. Feudalism emerged during this time in the political as well as social scene. Christianity also expanded and it came into power. So there was a continuous struggle in between churches and the king. Later, Islam's also expanded. So there was continuous wars, especially crusades were undertaken by these Christians in order to regain the power in the Holy Land. So the crusades were happened in between Islams and Muslims. So that was in order to regain the power on the Holy Land. And it was during this Middle Ages several famines, plagues and also wars were brought. So these are the great calamities happened during this time. Even the Black Death had killed 1/3 of total population of Europe. So these were the major incident happened in Europe during the time of Middle Ages. Now let's check the literary features of Europe during this time. When we check the literary output of Middle Age of Europe, we can see that a large number of prose and verse were introduced during this period. But most of the works were anonymous because we can't trace back the real authorship of many of the works. But still, middle period of European literature brings forth ballads, romances, especially historical romances, then lyrical poetry, allegorical poetry, sacred poems, lullabies, morality plays, miracle plays, etc. Now let's check who are the major literary figures during the time. Middle Ages produced a large quantity of verse and prose, but it doesn't possess the quality of classical works of Greece and Rome. Some of the major writers during this period were, first one is Saint Augustine. He was a praise writer and he was popular for his work The Confessions and The City of Gold. The Confessions was his spiritual autobiography. Another important figure is Boethius. He was a Roman writer. He wrote his most famous work, The Consolation of Philosophy, while he was awaiting the execution in prison. So, Consolation of Philosophy was his important work. Another important figure is Dante Alighieri. He was one of the world's greatest poets. His important works are The New Life and The Divine Comedy. The actual name of The New Life is La Vita Nuova and Divine Comedy is Divina Commedia. The New Life is a commemoration of Dante's love for Beatrice, and the Divine Comedy, which is a masterpiece of him written in the Italian dialect Tuscan. That particular work, the Divine Comedy, is divided into 3 books: Hell, Purgatory and Heaven. A good number of literary output were produced during the time of Middle Ages. Everyman was a famous example of a morality play. The Romance of the Rose was an allegorical poem. Reynard the Fox was a beast epic. The Owl and the Nightingale was a literary debate. Beowulf was very famous alliterative verse of Anglo-Saxon. Then English prose writers are Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, etc. were famous literary output produced during the time of Middle Ages. At that time in England, the very famous writer William Langland produced an English poem. It was Piers the Plowman. So Later, in the English literary scene, Geoffrey Chaucer came forward. He was the greatest medieval English poet and he is considered as the father of English poetry. The Canterbury Tale is his longest poem. So, in short, we can say that medieval literature were religious, chivalric, as well as realistic. So, this was a major literary output of European literature during the time of Middle Ages. Next period in the history of Europe is the Renaissance period. The Renaissance period is actually a midway in between Middle Ages and Modern Ages. Renaissance period covers almost 300 years from 14th century to 17th century. It is during this time in Europe trade expanded and bourgeoisie emerges. Rome as a superpower ceased to exist and new countries like Britain, France, Spain emerges. Later, it is in the 16th century, the religious abuses led to the Reformation and which was ignited by Martin Luther. This Reformation resulted Protestantism by Roman Catholics. Secularism and revival of trade and secularism made the people of England more individualistic. And this is the age which witnessed new exploration by Marco Polo, Columbus, Vasco da Gama and Magellan. Later, these European countries like Portugal, Spain, Dutch and England expanded their colonies all over the world. Many scientists also emerged during this time like Galileo, Copernicus and Kepler. And this period also witnessed the revival of classicism and as a result, Gutenberg introduced printing press for the first time. So Italy was the first to experience the Renaissance. It was evident not only in literature but also in art forms and other streams like philosophy, science and even government. Famous artists like Da Vinci, Michelangelo and Raphael, these are the world famous painters, they also emerges with their paintings during this Renaissance period. And when we analyze the literary features of Renaissance, we can say that it is Renaissance. The word Renaissance means a rebirth. Okay, so it was a rebirth of humanism. In literature, we can see rebirth of humanism. Simple and practical human life were the themes of many pieces of literature. Renaissance writers continued to experiment with new genres and types of literature, and they also attempt to imitate the classical works. In poetry, lyrical forms were still the favorite. During this time, Petrarch popularized his sonnet form, that is Petrarchan sonnet, and Villon popularized French ballad. Prose tales and romances were written in abundance. Utopian literature was introduced by Thomas More and Spanish picaresque novels were also introduced. Bacon and Montaigne were the famous essay writers during this time. Then another important speciality is classical rules of drama. It was ignored by Shakespeare and he introduced 3 unities in drama. And Ben Jonson came forward with his new forms of comedy. Beaumont and Fletcher were also introduced certain forms of tragic comedies. So these were the major literary features of the period Renaissance. Now let's check which are the major contributors from literature as well as in arts to the rich cultural history of European literature during Renaissance period. In Renaissance literature, we find emphasis on pervading desire for individual fulfillment to develop one's artistic, physical and intellectual facets to create the complete man, learned and skillful in many fields. So there were a lot of writers from various nations like Italy, France, Spain and England. So from Italy, Francisco Petrarca was a famous figure. He was popularly known as Petrarch. He was the founder of Italian Renaissance. He wrote a great quantity of literature in Latin. His famous volume of Italian poetry is the Songbook, which is a collection of 367 poems. Of these, 117 are sonnets plus odes, ballads, and madrigals. Petrarchan sonnet was another output put forward by Petrarch. It was a sonnet form of 14 lines containing octave and sestet. Another important figure was Boccaccio. He was a writer of prose and poetry in Latin and vernacular Italian. He was one of the world's greatest storytellers. The Decameron is his famous short story collection. Three writers were three greatest Italian Renaissance writers were Louis Pulci, Maria Biodo, Ludovico Aristo. They were three greatest Italian Renaissance writers of romantic epics. And another important figure was Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli. He wrote comedy, novella, dialogues, and history. The Prince is his famous literary output. Torquato Tasso was another writer from Italy. He was the writer of the very famous epic Jerusalem Delivered. And from France, we have Villon. He was a poet famous for his poetic form ballads. The Ballad of Dead Ladies, Grand Testament, etc. are his famous works. Another important figure in the history of European literature is Michael de Montaigne. He may be familiar to you. And he was the writer of personal essays, author of massive and influential volume of essays entitled Essays. And from Spain also we have different writers, and the important one is Cervantes, Miguel de Cervantes. He was the greatest literary figure. The world famous classical novel Don Quixote is written by him. During Renaissance period, a number of English writers had gifted their literary output to European literature. Sir Thomas More, he was the author of famous political romance Utopia, and Edmund Spenser was a major English poet after Chaucer. His masterpiece was The Faerie Queene. John Lyly was remembered for his novel Euphues, which was a prose romance. Francis Bacon, the father of English essay, he was famous for his aphoristic style. Philip Sidney, famous for the sonnet sequence Asdrubal and Stella. And Christopher Marlowe, he was the greatest Elizabethan dramatist, and later he was famous for his drama Dr. Faustus. Another important wonder in the history of world literature was William Shakespeare. He was a great Elizabethan dramatist. Later, John Donne astonished us with his metaphysical poetry, and John Milton, during the Puritan time, he came forward with his famous work Paradise Lost. From Germany, we have a wonderful figure, Martin Luther. He was a German religious reformer. Later, in a French Protestant reformer, John Calvin also gifted certain literary output to European literature. In short, we can say that literature of the Renaissance period was essentially humanistic in nature. Okay, my dear students, I hope you understood various topics discussed today. Please do this home assignment and send me back through WhatsApp. Then only you will get attendance. See you in the next class. Take care. Bye.